I never thought a quiet suburban street could turn into a battlefield. Until Karen showed up. She was the type of HOA member who smiled sweetly at community meetings while quietly plotting against anyone who dared to claim a piece of their own property. At first, it was small things. Complaints about a garden gnome, a minor violation of parking rules. But then it escalated. One afternoon, I noticed she had actually tried to redraw my property line as if my own backyard wasn't mine anymore. I was frozen, unsure how to respond, until something completely unexpected happened. Something no one could have predicted. My maid, someone I'd always seen as quiet and unassuming, suddenly became the key to turning the tables. But the way she did it would leave Karen speechless. How could a simple act of speaking a few words in another language unravel all of Karen's schemes and expose her in front of the entire neighborhood? Life on Cedarwood Lane was exactly the kind of calm, suburban perfection people imagine when they think of safe neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, neighbors greeting each other with waves in the morning. My family, my spouse, 2 kids, and I had moved here 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of quiet streets and friendly neighbors. Our home had a modest but well-kept backyard, a small vegetable garden my spouse tended religiously, and a porch where I liked to drink my morning coffee while watching the sunrise over the manicured lawns. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. The HOA in our community had a reputation for being helpful, organizing block parties, enforcing neighborhood aesthetics, and occasionally sending friendly reminders about lawn maintenance. At first, they felt like the kind of organization that existed to protect property values, not dictate every detail of your life. But subtle signs of control were already lurking beneath the surface. Friendly letters reminding residents about acceptable fence heights and landscaping aesthetics arrived in the mail, but there was an underlying tone that hinted at consequences if you ignored them. I dismissed it as normal bureaucracy. After all, rules existed for a reason, right? Then there was Karen. On paper, she was just another HOA board member. In reality, she carried herself with the precision of someone who believed she was the unofficial queen of Cedarwood Lane. She had a knack for turning trivial HOA rules into personal vendettas. At first, she seemed harmless. I met her once at a community meeting where she smiled, nodded politely, and congratulated residents on their beautiful homes. But there was something in her eyes, a glint of control, a desire to assert authority, that left me uneasy. Life continued as usual, with children laughing in the cul-de-sac, neighbors borrowing sugar, and weekend barbecues filling the air with the smell of grilled meats. I felt like we were part of a small, connected community. But if I had paid closer attention, I would have noticed the way Karen would linger near new homeowners, the casual remarks she made about property lines and community standards, the subtle power plays that others seemed too polite or too afraid to confront. I was unaware that these early warnings were just the tip of the iceberg. They were whispers of the conflict to come, the first hints that what seemed like a peaceful street was actually a stage for escalating tension. Little did I know that the serenity of my backyard, the very land I had worked so hard to care for, would soon become a battleground over rights, pride, and principle. And at the heart of this unfolding drama was someone I had always underestimated. My quiet, seemingly unremarkable maid, whose presence in our lives would soon change everything. At first, the signs were subtle, almost laughable. A letter slipped under my door one morning claiming that my front garden exceeded HOA-approved dimensions because my sunflowers were too tall and aggressive looking. I stared at the paper in disbelief. The blooms had grown naturally, following the sun, yet somehow this was a violation. I tried to shrug it off, thinking it's just bureaucracy, nothing serious. But the trivial complaints quickly escalated. A week later, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting, insisting that my backyard fence encroached on communal property. She produced maps that were clearly outdated, drawings that ignored my actual property line by several feet. I attempted to explain politely, showing my deed and surveying documents, but Karen's smile never faltered. Her voice carried the kind of icy certainty that left no room for argument. By the time the meeting ended, I was mentally exhausted, my frustration building like pressure in a kettle. Then came the fines. Notices of increasingly absurd fees started arriving. 200 for improper landscaping, a 150 for unauthorized outdoor structures, and even $50 for parking violations when my spouse's car occasionally blocked a portion of the street during errands. Each notice was accompanied by the same subtle threat: pay immediately or face additional penalties. My heart sank every time I opened the mailbox. Neighbors began whispering, some sympathetic, some anxious. It became clear that Karen's influence ran deep. One afternoon, while unloading groceries, I overheard two HOA members discussing how I had to be taught a lesson. That phrase haunted me. This wasn't just enforcement of rules, it was personal. The neighborhood that had once felt warm and inviting now felt like a courtroom, with me perpetually on trial. It wasn't only Karen's official power that caused tension. Small acts of sabotage began surfacing. The sprinkler system in my backyard mysteriously failed one morning, flooding my vegetable garden. On another occasion, my trash bins were knocked over repeatedly, scattered across the lawn in the dead of night. Someone had even scratched words into my driveway: property theft, etched with precision. It was harassment, and yet there was no evidence pointing to any culprit, no proof, just intimidation. I started taking photos, documenting every event, hoping it would be enough if things spiraled further. The pressure began to affect my family. My spouse spent hours worrying about potential fines. My kids felt the tension and grew quieter. I began losing sleep, constantly thinking about what Karen might do next. The neighborhood I had once loved had become a minefield, every small action scrutinized, every smile from a neighbor potentially masking judgment or complicity. Then came the incident that pushed me to the edge. One sunny afternoon, a surveyor arrived unexpectedly at my door, claiming to be from the HOA. He was there to measure the disputed property line that Karen had been obsessed with. I immediately asked for credentials, only to discover he was working freelance, handpicked by Karen with no legal authority. I realized then that this wasn't about rules anymore. It was a game of intimidation, a psychological tactic designed to exhaust me until I gave in. Each day felt like a ticking clock. Notices, subtle sabotage, and manipulative neighbors built a crescendo of tension that left me anxious to the point of paranoia. Yet amid all this chaos, a quiet determination grew. I refused to surrender my home or my dignity. I began researching HOA laws, consulting local attorneys, and strategizing ways to defend myself without stooping to their level. Every harassment attempt became a puzzle. How could I turn this tide without creating legal trouble for myself? And then there was my maid, May. I had always seen her as calm, almost invisible in the whirlwind of neighborhood drama. But I noticed small signs of awareness in her eyes, quiet observations that hinted she understood more than anyone gave her credit for. Little did I know her knowledge, particularly of language and negotiation, would become the secret weapon I never anticipated. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Karen, without warning, parked her luxury SUV partially on my property, claiming it was common area, and threatening towing if I moved it. I stared at the vehicle, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. I wanted to confront her directly, but something in May's demeanor suggested patience, a silent plan forming in the background. Could someone so understated really turn the tables on Karen's growing audacity? And if so, how? The stage was set. Fines, intimidation, and petty sabotage had pushed me to the brink, and the neighborhood that once promised tranquility had revealed itself as a labyrinth of power plays and silent threats. Every morning, I awoke expecting the next cruel surprise, never knowing how far Karen would go, and what quiet, unassuming ally might just have the power to expose her schemes in ways no one could predict. The day everything came to a head started like any other, deceptively ordinary. I was tending my garden when I noticed Karen striding across the lawn, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She had a look that made my stomach churn, a mix of smug authority and unspoken threat. Behind her, a few HOA board members followed, all silently observing as if rehearsing for some private performance. Karen immediately launched into accusations. My backyard fence, she claimed, violated multiple community guidelines, and she had brought a photographer to document every offense. It was clear she intended to create a permanent record of my alleged infractions. I felt my chest tighten. I could have argued, shouted, or stormed off, but experience had taught me that rational debate was futile with someone like her. This time, I had to act strategically. That's when May stepped forward, quiet, composed, and, most importantly, confident. She began speaking in Mandarin to one of the visiting HOA members, who turned pale and whispered hurriedly to Karen. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. Karen, used to controlling every scenario, suddenly looked uneasy. Her confident posture faltered, her words stumbled. May continued, calmly translating and clarifying in English, revealing subtle discrepancies in Karen's official documentation, pointing out misrepresentations, and calmly stating legal boundaries that Karen had conveniently ignored. Karen's face turned crimson as whispers spread among the board members. It became painfully clear that May wasn't just translating. She was exposing Karen's manipulations in real time, systematically dismantling her claims. The entire board was caught off guard. Karen's carefully orchestrated attack, built over weeks of harassment and intimidation, began to unravel right before her eyes. Karen, sensing her authority slipping, tried to escalate. She demanded that I remove my fence immediately and threatened legal action. But I stayed silent, letting May continue her methodical work. Her Mandarin phrases weren't just translation. They were coded statements, precise references to laws and property rights that Karen could neither counter nor publicly dispute. The tension was electric. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster for Karen. Then came the final blow. Mai had secretly gathered neighborhood affidavits from residents who had witnessed Karen's repeated harassment and rule manipulations. In a calm but firm tone, she presented them, translating any necessary details and ensuring every word held legal weight. Karen was flustered, desperate, fumbling through her papers. The smug, confident aura she had worn for months collapsed into visible panic. The board, who had once nodded unquestioningly at her suggestions, now looked uneasy, some whispering to one another. Karen attempted one last power move, trying to claim that the affidavits were irrelevant. Mai responded with a quiet, unyielding statement. These are legally recognized observations, and your documentation is falsified. You are in violation of the community rules you enforce. The words hit with the weight of undeniable truth. Karen's arrogance had met its match. For the first time, Karen hesitated. She attempted a dismissive smile, but it faltered as the room shifted. Board members glanced at each other, realizing that her schemes could now reflect poorly on them if they sided with her. The power dynamics had flipped entirely. Karen, the once unshakable authority figure, was now isolated, exposed, and humiliated. Her threats no longer carried weight. Her intimidation tactics had failed spectacularly. As the confrontation wound down, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Weeks of harassment, fines, and sabotage had built up a pressure so intense it had seemed unbearable. But now, thanks to May's intelligence, foresight, and quiet courage, the tide had turned. Karen stormed off in frustration, her clipboard left behind, a symbol of her unraveling control. Standing there, surveying the aftermath, I realized something profound. The victory wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about reclaiming peace, dignity, and respect in a neighborhood where power had been wielded unfairly. The tension had peaked, the battle had been fought, and the scales had finally tipped in favor of reason, truth, and clever, quiet resilience. Yet as I watched Karen disappear down the street, I knew the story wasn't completely over. There would be repercussions, lingering gossip, and perhaps subtle attempts at retaliation. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. And more importantly, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful allies are the ones you least expect. The days following Karen's public humiliation felt surreal. Cedarwood Lane seemed almost normal again, but beneath the familiar hum of lawnmowers and children's laughter, the neighborhood had subtly shifted. People no longer avoided eye contact when passing my home. Instead, some offered quiet smiles, nods of respect, or even casual congratulations. It was as if a silent acknowledgement had passed among neighbors, the balance of power had changed, and the rules of engagement were no longer dictated by fear. Karen, predictably, tried to maintain appearances. She continued attending HOA meetings, but her authoritative voice carried less weight, her confident posture replaced by the careful, measured gestures of someone aware that every move was being watched. It was almost poetic. Her months of intimidation reduced to cautious restraint. Even the board, who had previously nodded along with her demands, now questioned each motion she proposed, applying a newfound scrutiny. The very system she had manipulated against me had begun to turn against her. For my family, the relief was tangible. My children played in the backyard again without fear of petty complaints. My spouse could finally tend to the garden in peace. I could once again enjoy my morning coffee on the porch without the gnawing anxiety that had defined the past weeks. But beyond these immediate comforts, a deeper lesson had been learned resilience. Strategy and the quiet courage of unexpected allies can overcome even the most persistent bullies. May, my maid, became something of a quiet legend in our household. Her bravery, intellect, and ability to navigate complex social dynamics had been the key to our victory. We began to see her not just as help around the house, but as a trusted confidante and strategic partner. Her presence reminded me that strength often comes from those we least expect, and that humility and patience can be far more powerful than aggression. Over time, Karen attempted minor retaliations. Whisper campaigns, passive-aggressive notes, and petty complaints about neighbors' lawns or fences. But the neighborhood had changed. Residents no longer tolerated her overreach. Her influence had eroded. The irony was almost satisfying. Her obsession with control had ultimately isolated her, while those she had underestimated. My family, the community, and especially stood united and vigilant. In a broader sense, the experience reshaped how I viewed community engagement. I became more involved in HOA meetings, not out of fear or obligation, but to ensure fairness and transparency. I started documenting every interaction, building a network of supportive neighbors, and fostering a sense of accountability that had been absent before. The HOA, once a source of stress and intimidation, gradually became a forum for balanced governance, largely because the precedent of Karen's exposure had shifted power dynamics. Emotionally, the resolution was profound. The months of tension, anxiety, and sleepless nights had left scars, but also resilience. I realized that the conflict had taught me more about strategy, human behavior, and the importance of observing carefully before acting than any peaceful existence ever could. I had learned that justice does not always come swiftly, but persistence, intelligence, and allies, especially quiet, unassuming ones, can tip the scales in ways that brute force never could. Looking back, I can see the irony that pervades the story. Karen, who believed her meticulous manipulation of HOA rules would secure absolute control, ended up exposing herself to the very community she sought to dominate. My quiet maid, once overlooked, became the decisive factor in restoring fairness. And my family, once anxious and reactive, emerged wiser, more resilient, and better equipped to navigate the delicate balance of neighborhood politics. Even now, years later, when new neighbors move in or minor disputes arise, I remember those weeks vividly. The story is no longer about fear or intimidation. It's about empowerment, vigilance, and the unexpected ways people can rise to meet challenges. Every time I tell it, neighbors listen with a mix of disbelief and admiration, and I can see them reflecting on their own small battles in daily life. The takeaway is simple but powerful. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the patient strategists, or the unexpected allies. Sometimes, the person who appears least likely to act is the one who changes everything. And sometimes, victory is not about confrontation or aggression. It's about timing, insight, and knowing when to let truth and skill speak louder than threats. So, the question I leave to anyone listening today is this: in your own life, who might be the quiet ally you've overlooked, and what might happen if they finally had their chance to speak? Sometimes the smallest, most unassuming actions can ripple outward to create consequences far beyond what anyone imagined.